So which factions in Warhammer 40k are most deserving of a release wave? If the fans could decide, what army would get the next batch of models from Games Workshop, and which would come next after them? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking model soldiers and Games Workshop release waves, doing a slightly more data-driven look at what should come next, with a top 10 of the armies or sub-ranges that are most deserving of a refresh in current 40k. The way that Games Workshop usually tends to do model releases is they'll typically operate in release waves. They tend to make at least one new miniature for each army in the game each edition these days, but a lot of the time those miniatures might just be a slightly token character release, maybe a new named or generic HQ to add to the army, and perhaps not really expanding options by all that much. More interesting tend to be the armies that actually get a proper release wave, usually Games Workshop saving things up so they've got quite a lot of kits to release all at once for that army. The overall effect probably being more efficient for them as you actually tempt people into starting that faction completely anew. And quite a bit of the time, a bunch of those new kits are discounted in a launch box, say like this Deathcore Krieg one from early 2025, as well as just having a bunch of new kits for a faction. Quite a lot of these launch waves tend to be done around a certain sub-theme within an army, say for example the Deathcore for the Guard, the Kroot for the Tau, Deathwing for Dark Angels, or Aspect Warriors for the Eldari. They definitely do some more general purpose ones like the recent Votan wave, but it means that new batches of kits can be targeted at sub-themes within an army, as well as just the armies themselves. For this one I thought I'd ask you guys which ones most deserve to come next, both weighing up some entirely new armies, sub-themes within some factions, or army updates in general, and talk through the 10 that were voted highest on channel polls recently, to see which ones you guys would most consider a priority. First up, for a few honourable mentions, these were a bunch of the ones on the polls or suggested that didn't quite make the top 10. I tried to include a mix of factions that maybe have more obvious updates likely coming, like say the Dark Angels Raven Wing, some armies where they could expand them quite easily, and then added in a bunch of ones that were suggested by your suggestions as the poll went on. The more popular ones that didn't quite break into the top 10, the Thousand Sons were up there, the first of the Deity Legions to get a proper update, and also meaning that they're the ones that have gone the longest without a proper release wave. We've also got Eldari Exodites, Chaos Demons, Dark Angels Raven Wing, which is broadly quite expected, and a whole bunch of others. Voted very lowest, but I included it because it seems kind of likely are the remaining Space Marine Firstborn units. I guess no one's going to vote that Space Marines are more deserving of more models at this point. Otherwise, people don't seem to be particularly interested in seeing more Imperial Agents units, and Blood Angels Death Company were far down the list, despite them not really having any proper models at the moment. I'm still going to say they're probably going to be likely for some time next edition. Obviously, being a deserving or undeserving army doesn't necessarily mean that Games Workshop is going to release more or less of any one thing though. It's been rumoured to be Space Marines and Orcs for 11th edition as the main focal factions. I'm sure if so, they both sell really well for Games Workshop, even if the average 40k player wouldn't exactly say that they're deserving of more kits versus plenty of the other factions out there. Getting into the top 10 proper though, and first up we have Admech Automata. I feel like this one's been a particular talking point over the past year or so, with Games Workshop redoing a bunch of their Heresy era Admech Automata in plastic, many from the frustrated tech priests of the 41st millennium itching to add new shiny robots to their collection. But these ones aren't aimed for Warhammer 40k, they don't really have very easy near proxies within the Admech roster, they didn't ever get any Legends rules, and they're certainly not in the Admech Codex. For the Forge World and then Heresy side of Adeptus Mechanicus, it feels like the Admech very nearly had the same sort of treatment as Custodes and Knights with their sort of half plastic, half Forge World resin range. It's believed by a good number of people that Admech were going to have their Forge World units brought into Warhammer 40k with one of the old Forge World black books called Fires of Syraxis. If that one had wound up ever coming out, maybe there's a good chance that either the Admech would have Legends rules for these now, or potentially even have them treated in a similar sort of way to Custodes and Knights, and have their armies as Imperial armor rules, potentially good for competitive play if you wanted to. It seems very unlikely that Games Workshop would reverse course in a big way, and give these either Legends rules or better yet full-fledged rules for 40k. And I guess if the Adeptus Mechanicus players want Automata for 40k, we'd actually have to wait for Games Workshop to release some for the game. If they did try and make separate ones for Warhammer 40k, I guess they'd go maybe a bit like the Castellan robots and make them sort of near equivalents but not directly crossing over with the Heresy range. There's plenty of classes that they could do similar though, having big gun ones like the Thanatar perhaps, or hovering ones like the Stratos ones. In any case, they were ranked a little bit ahead of a fair few other options on the list, and seems like there's some good demand for the Admech getting some shiny new robots. Next up and placing in 9th here we have the Harlequins, the mysterious holo-suited guardians of the Black Library, enacting war as a great performance, and often turning up unbidden to help either the Craft Worlds or the Drukhari. Their miniature range came out in 2015, and Games Workshop haven't really done just about anything with them since. They did get an interesting sort of medium-sized release wave there, both the Harlequin troops, the Skyweavers, and their skimmer transports, plus the individual character models, The only Harlequin release since then has been Kaiganil paired with Ephrael Stern for the Sisters of Battle, but that's not exactly the biggest help to actual Harlequin players. In that time, they were a standalone faction for a fair bit, and then eventually got folded into Codex Eldari, sort of in a halfway sort of state in 9th edition, and then a bit more thoroughly in 10th. They still have their major sub-faction sort of vibes though, getting a themed attachment and some allied rules to allow them to join to the Drukhari. When they were a standalone faction, it did mean that 2,000 point armies of them tended to be a bit on the limited side. They really didn't exactly have a big roster of units, so you'd expect a lot of spam of the same things over and over again. And perhaps between their lore being a bit niche and their model range being quite so limited, you really didn't tend to get too many people collecting them as a fully fledged faction. For amount of people collecting a faction, it often tends to be Deathwatch in last and then Harlequins in second last before more modern times. I can't help but wonder if that might be some of the reason that Games Workshop's not super keen to have extra support for them. For miniatures to release, it maybe feels just a little bit less obvious as to what they could do with them in a majorly different way to what they do now. Their theme of Space Elf performers is just a little bit narrower in scope, though even then I still feel like there's enough fairly straightforward ideas that you could do a release wave. They've often had a unit called Mimes mentioned in the lore, so a different sort of infantry type there potentially. You could have a jetbike character to lead the Skyweaver jetbikes. You could do named characters either as a jetbike or on foot. Maybe go for some other circus performer aesthetics, jugglers or fire breathers, that sort of thing. And if they wanted to do a sort of centerpiece kit for them, they could maybe go for an avatar of the Laughing God. We have avatars of Cain and avatars of Iniad. That could be an option for a big central character release for the Harlequins if they wanted to. Seems like a good number of people will be happy to see Harlequins get a little bit more love. I'd be more tempted by adding units in as opposed to updating and replacing though. I feel like as they go, their current miniatures hold up pretty well. Before we move onwards and up the list, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice. They're one option for some themed faction dice, having really quite a vast range of different designs shipping out from the USA. Their main offerings tend to be this sort of thing, a whole bunch of dice with fancy logos on that could fit in with a range of wargaming factions out there. Their typical offerings being 25 dice for $35 or £28 plus some PMP. Most of their designs having options for squared and rounded corners, and above all have a whole ton of variety. There's ones that could fit in well enough for the majority of 40k factions out there, and plenty more wargaming armies besides. If you do wind up picking any up, they gave me a code ALLSPECS for 5% off, so be sure to use that if you do wind up picking up anything from them. They have the channel logo merch dice that they made for me as well. I was particularly impressed with these things and how they looked. And also, given it's the festive season, they've got some dice advent calendars on offer as well. Quite a few different designs of these with different mixes of resin, metal and other fancy dice in there. Maybe a bit more aimed at RPGs versus wargaming, but might be of interest to some of you. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. If you'd like to take a look over their stuff, their link's down in the video description below. Next up, and ranking in 8th place, we have the Emperor's Children. Interesting to see that 40k's newest faction certainly has plenty of demand for a second follow-up wave. Games Workshop basically seems to have launched a couple of the Chaos Legions on a bit more of a bare bones format so far. The Emperor's Children and the World Eaters both got a release wave, but maybe not quite as much as people might have hoped. And for the Emperor's Children in particular, they did wind up lacking a fair few more generic Chaos Space Marine units, so perhaps feel a bit more limited there without access to things like Cultists or a Cultist equivalent, or some more generic kit like Predator tanks. For most of the Chaos Deity Legions though, there's some really obvious gaps that they could fill. A fair few of them may be inspired by the Death Guard and the relatively larger range release that they got. I'm sure unique Terminators would be pretty tempting to plenty of people, maybe some Phoenix style ones but made a bit more 40k and debauched and crazy. Maybe some sort of bigger heavy hitter would also be a tempting one. You could have a Sonic Dreadnought, which they've had in the past on the top right here, or perhaps a Predator tank with some Sonic gear or something like that. And as with the Death Guard and their multiple different demon engines, you could have some sort of twisted Slaneshi demon engine maybe. They had one called a Slanesh Subjugator at epic scale, even if I wouldn't exactly like to think what a demon engine of Slanesh might be trying to do to you. Another one that seems almost inevitable is some sort of unique raised cultist design. That did feel like an odd one to leave out, given that the other Deity Legions all have a raised cultist of one sort or another. So maybe Games Workshop prioritised releasing an extra Space Marine unit rather than more cultists, which might not have been the worst thing to prioritise if they had to pick and choose one of the two. Finally, you could go for other generic Space Marine things, perhaps bikers or a Doom Rider style miniature could be fun. That was one special character they had in the past that they could bring back. Next up and voted in 7th were the Adeptus Custodes and converting their Forge World range to plastic. For basically since they came out in modern 40k, Custodes have been in the weird sort of place where their plastic range is super cheap and they're one of the cheapest armies to get into. But then if you wanted to expand to a few of their units that actually make them into a more proper well-rounded army, you're either paying through the nose at Forge World prices or getting various 3D printed proxies elsewhere. They've got loads of units here, including the ranged Sagittarium Custodes, their unique Dreadnoughts, their gun tanks and jump infantry. they might be in a bit of a precarious position as to whether or not they make the full conversion into Warhammer 40k. It kind of seems unlikely they're going to actually go into the Adeptus Custodes Codex, even if that would be the dream. The main issue is that Games Workshop seem to have largely converted Forge World ranges to be focused on the Heresy era these days. So when they do get updates and converted to plastic, it's likely going to be in Horus Heresy packaging and primarily aimed at that game system. And with the Space Marines back in 9th edition when they released some Contempt Dreadnoughts and the like, it didn't really stop them marketing them at Warhammer 40k and then sending them to Legends in 10th. Hopefully Games Workshop sort themselves out. It does seem that we are getting some plastic Custodes in the not too distant future as per the teaser for the Horus Heresy. And there's the potential for some expansion for the Sisters of Silence range at the same time. I'm a bit less certain how much of that might get ported into Warhammer 40k, given that they have a few things in the rules for Heresy that aren't available to use in 40k right now. It will be nice to see 40k era Custodes as a bit more of a normal army with the standard sort of support things, which basically are already out there, but weirdly not kept in their codex. Next up and voted in 6th place was a release wave for the Core Codex Chaos Space Marines, and particularly focusing on their main themes of traitor legions within the Core Codex. Given their fairly big status and popularity in the Horus Heresy, it's just a bit surprising that we don't have pretty much any specific legions representation for, say, Alpha Legion or Iron Warriors for models in the Codex. And maybe the lack of support feels even more noticeable now Games Workshop have gone through the Core Codex Space Marine chapters and released not 1 but 2 characters for them. So most of their loyalist equivalents like Imperial Fist and Salamanders and Friends, they both have 2 characters and an upgrade sprue now. Hopefully at some point Games Workshop does similar for the Traitor Legions. There's plenty of characters with big names in the lore they could adapt for, say, Word Bearers, Night Lords or Iron Warriors and Friends. I'm sure plenty of the legions would really quite enjoy getting a sort of Night Lords kit treatment. As Games Workshop upgrade sprues go, that was about one of the best received ones they've ever done. There's also at least a couple of Primarchs out there that they could basically release whenever they want to. Lorgar and Perturabo are both alive and abroad in the galaxy. I'm sure there'd be nothing to stop them redoing Alpharius as well, even if he is supposedly lore dead. We did get a rumour engine that looked like it was an Alpha Legion Pale Spear, so maybe that could be a miniature for them. It could easily be a Horus Heresy or limited edition miniature for all we know though. In any case, I can't help but think with 2 passes through the major loyalist chapters of Space Marines, it's probably the Chaos turn now to get something for each of their legions. Though I do kind of wonder if Games Workshop does eventually want to release the Demon Primarchs. Perhaps we might not get anything major for them until they actually try and flesh them out a bit more as their own individual armies, perhaps with Demon Primarch, another named character, and some sort of a unique unit. Voted in 5th place we have the World Eaters, another one of 40k's most recent fully fledged factions, and like the Emperor's Children got a release wave with some of the basics, though still quite a lot behind armies like the Death Guard with their major release wave they got in 8th edition. People were rather speculating and hoping that World Eaters might get a follow-up release wave in 10th edition in a similar sort of style to how the Leagues of Votan did. And again, like the Emperor's Children, there's a fair bit of inspiration that you could draw from the other deity legions, plus a few things of their own that just seem a little bit more likely. Again, unique Terminators are definitely on the wish list, either Red Butchers or in a similar sort of style to those. Any sort of on-theme Terminators I think would be enjoyed rather a lot. It seems that we got 8 bound initially instead of those as their elite choice though. Another option could be Berserker Juggernaut Cavalry. It did seem that they might have been teased in art in their initial Codex release, and it might make sense at least on paper to have something for those Juggernaut Lords and Lord Invocatus to lead. A character release that's almost certainly guaranteed is the Berserker Surgeon or Butcher Surgeon. They're the rather depraved World Eaters apothecaries that maintain the Butcher's nails, create new World Eaters and 8-bound. And if I had to guess an individual character release for 10th edition, I would have guessed it to be this one, though we got the Slaughterbound instead. This one feels like it's enough of an open secret. We've even had people making up some fake box art for this, and when it does drop I really wouldn't be too surprised if it's not so very far from the truth. Otherwise, having a more standard Lord on foot and one in Terminator armour would be nice, and maybe again Demon Engines, perhaps a mid-sized one in a similar sort of way to a Blood Slaughterer perhaps. A unique Hellbrute could be another option, though I feel like the generic one works okay for the World Eaters. They could do Raptors and Bikers as well. Feels like there's no real reason that the World Eaters shouldn't have those too, as different ways to throw Cornate Violence into melee nice and fast. Overall feels like a lot of ways in which you could expand the army and make them into a more well-rounded army range, so it's a bit frustrating to World Eater players when they didn't really deliver on any of these in 10th. Next up and voted in 4th were the Dark Mechanicum. They've been one of the most popular new armies that Games Workshop could add to the game for quite some time, and I certainly suspect that they are going to release them at some stage, and it's probably more of a question of when as opposed to if. And we're asking people what release waves they'd like to see. Interesting they rank kind of near the top, though not at the top. I feel like in Warhammer 40k there's often people saying that Games Workshop should maintain the armies that they actually have ranges for first, before moving on to yet new factions to sell at us. These guys are the tech heretics that came down on the traitors' side during the Horus Heresy, and have been hard at work ever since on more disturbing creations. It feels like Vashtor the Archifane is probably the harbinger of them, perhaps feeling just a little bit out of place with his place in the Chaos Space Marine army right now. It would be quite cool to see him develop an army of his own. What they could do with these could be really quite big in scope. We have seen a few different hints of them and interpretations in different ways. Say things like the Legions Imperialis rather spider-like walkers. There were the Negavolt cultists from Blackstone Fortress that feel like they could be very easily more widely interpreted into a 40k unit. There's a couple of characters from the Horus Heresy. I was seeing a sort of loyalist Man of Iron as well. I'm sure they could have some Tech Heresy striding alongside them in the ranks if they wanted. Games Workshop have literally gone through and ticked off the majority of fan request armies to a greater or lesser extent over the years. There's maybe only a few left with things like the Eldar Exodites, Legion of the Damned, and Dark Mechanicum that they haven't really done so much in 40k. It does feel like there are a lot of army with a lot of potential and lots of different ways they could take them, though perhaps similar to the Adeptus Mechanicus, they are going to have to choose a few specific things that they want to release, so hopefully they wind up making a good job of them when they do. Next up, and voted third most deserving of a release wave, were the Astra Militarum Catachan Jungle Fighters, and their standard infantry units are maybe some of the single most dated looking miniatures in Warhammer 40k at this point, going from an era a fair bit before things like the Grey Knights, which are also considered to be showing their age at this point. When I did some polls and votes as to some of people's least favourite models in Warhammer 40k, the Catachan Jungle Fighters were one of the very highest in the entire game, and certainly feel rather out of place as one of the main three pillars of Guard infantry right now, next to Acadians that got a refresh in 9th edition, and Deathcore that got new kits in 10th. It perhaps just showed that Games Workshop can make some good Catachan models when they decided to do some limited release ones like Sergeant Ripper Jackson and the Colonel guy. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not they go straight into another Guard release wave in 11th edition. The Astra Militarum maybe haven't done so badly with updates in the recent past. Getting a major release wave both in 9th and in 10th is more than really quite a lot of armies got. Maybe Games Workshop's grand plan has been to redo the three major plastic pillars of the range one after the other, though I guess we'll see. If they did redo them, I guess we'd get infantry squads, heavy weapon squads, and a command squad. That seems to be the major Guard staples at the moment, and then beyond that there's plenty of character releases they could do. Perhaps a generic HQ, maybe Ironhand Strachan or Sergeant Harker or both. And Guardsman Marbo also needs an update out of his Finecast resin kit, otherwise I guess he's potentially at risk of being dropped. Feels like anything else on top of that might be a bit of a bonus, though they definitely could have other things. Maybe some sort of special weapon squad with a bunch of flamers or something. That'd feel fairly Catachan to me. They also do feel like one of the Guard regiments that'd make for a particularly good kill team kit if Games Workshop wanted to go that way. If they wanted to redo them, perhaps they could release them as a kill team kit as they did with the Death Corps, and then go on to do a full range refresh after that. Getting into the top two release waves most desired by you guys though, and in second place we have the Drukhari. I certainly agree that they're just one of the factions that are most objectively in need of new kits at the moment. Most of their existing plastic things came out from around 2010 when they had a major release, though I'd argue that the vast majority of their existing stuff holds up really quite well. It just doesn't really feel like they're crying out for an update compared with a few of the other 40k kits out there. The biggest issue for them is that literally in the place where Games Workshop have just not got around to updating their Finecast kits, it's got to the point that with 10th edition model removals, they've wound up taking out a bunch of units for the faction that have been staples for the army since some of its very earliest days. Grotesques, Urian Rakarth and Warp Beasts were all there in the first codex, and the Court of the Archon was a fun addition that came later. All of their kits were Finecast, and the majority of those admittedly weren't really particularly well fit for purpose. They really needed to be redone in a plastic box set. I would guess that eventually they will get around to doing them, but it's maybe a bit more of a question of motivation. It certainly felt pretty disappointing when Drukhari didn't get a release wave in 10th, as it's now got to the point where they're sending units to Legends as they literally don't sell them and haven't bothered to update them. Feels like some of those could be done as kill team kits if they wanted to. They did the Drukhari Mangdrakes that way. And if they did wind up doing a bigger release wave for them, you could have other named characters such as Duke Slicer or Karadurak. And there's one outstanding big bad of Warhammer 40k in Adrabel Vex. It would be really great to have him turn up as a centerpiece, if and when they ever did get around to doing a more major release for Drukhari. I'm sure any other flavours of Skimmer would go down rather well. You could remake some Forge World things like the Reaper or Tantalus, or sort of similar sort of size and scope one to those. I feel like any other releases beyond the ones that seem most necessary though are probably going to be a bit unlikely. It was nice to see Lady Malice and an updated Archon miniature though for 10th. It does feel like a bit of a consolation prize, but the Archon was definitely one that people were very happy to see updated given the sort of odd pose of the previous one. Finally though, and voted in first by you guys, we have the Knights of Titan. And again they feel like they're rather recent in people's minds, as they were another army that people were rather hoping for an update in 10th edition, but it seems that they've been passed over probably till next time. I'd be kind of surprised if they go through 11th without getting some sort of major release. They're just notable out of the Loyalist Space Marines now. They're the only ones left that haven't had a proper Primaris scale redoing, and also have the Drukhari sort of problem where they've had their resin kits just completely get taken away and not put back, and that's left their character range in a rather sorry state indeed, just literally Grandmaster Voldus and Castell and Crow for their unique miniatures, and that's literally it, besides a few kits that you could either kit bash or borrow from the Space Marines. I feel like a fair few elements that the Grey Knights are going to get are pretty predictable. Their two main kits will likely be Terminators and Power Armoured Marines. I don't know if there'll be some chance of separating out some of their Specialist Marines into their own kit. It is maybe a bit rare for Games Workshop to make model kits these days that represent 4 different units just from one box. Otherwise, the other really obvious area are character refreshes. It'd be nice to see an actual custom Grey Knight leader both in Terminator armour and in Power Armour. Maybe a Grandmaster or Brother Captain in the Terminator armour, perhaps a Brotherhood Champion in Power Armour. I have a feeling that they'd do a new resculpt of Caldor Drago himself, and perhaps Brother Captain Stern could be another possibility. I do wonder if they choose to refresh the Grey Knights, whether or not they'd do an updated Dread Knight kit. The fact they've chosen to release an upgrade sprue for it might imply they might not choose to. But it certainly feels like the sort of model that a lot of people would enjoy a refresh for, and they have had form with releasing an upgrade sprue and then invalidating it in the past. They did that for the Cadian shock troops, giving them some new details for the previous model kit, and then coming out with entirely new Cadians in the not too distant future after that. Hopefully it'll be next time for the Grey Knights. At the moment it certainly seems like faction enthusiasm for playing them is at a bit of a rock bottom. It doesn't really encourage a lot of people to jump into the army completely anew, if you are probably expecting they're going to have a big range release and a lot of things reinterpreted as a result. Let me know your thoughts on the potential army updates though. Are these the ones that you think would be most deserving of a refresh or not? And would you have rated any others for the top spot above, say, Grey Knights and Drukhari? I'll leave that one there for now though. Feel free to check out Baron of Dice, the video sponsor, if you'd like to take a look over their fancy dice things. They'll be down in the video description. They do have quite a bunch of dice offerings that could fit for a lot of factions, plus their new Dice Advent Calendar style things. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the videos and keep them coming, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.